Hey folks, how you doing? My name's Alistair. I'm the National Academic E-Learning Manager here on the Gold Coast campus, and it's time for a chat rather than another PowerPoint. And I've got on the call, as you can see on the right-hand side of your screen there, I've got David Stelfox, who's the Associate Program Leader of Naturopathic Medicine, and he's on the Adelaide campus. So half an hour behind, but always ahead. So David, it's an opportunity for us to have a chat about context, really. And the students have been on this adventure, on this kind of trail, exploring healing in different cultures, in different countries, in different times, from prehistory to history to modern day. And it's time to bring it into the modern day, essentially the 21st century. So, everybody, one of the reasons that David's on the line is because he's a mover and shaker in the naturopathic industry in Australia today, and he's going to talk us through that bridge, really, to the 21st century, that context. So, David, really, look over to you. I suppose the context is kind of how did we get here? You know, how did we go from all of the developments, in eclectic medicine, and all of that stuff, the herbal medicine traditions? How did we get here today in Australia?
Yeah, hi Al, and hi everybody. Hi again, everybody. It's a good question, and I think that you've probably been wondering, why am I learning all this about what was happening in North America, the United States of America, in the 19th century? What relevance does it have to me as a person studying natural medicine in the 21st century? And that's a pretty good question, but it has a lot of relevance, because if we look at the history of naturopathy and the history of natural medicine in Australia from the time of the first settlement, there's actually a parallel there with what was happening in the USA. And if we go back and look at the First Fleet, so 1788, we know that the First Fleet landed and settled in Australia. They brought with them their own doctors, their own nurses, their own midwives, etc. And what they were practicing, what the doctors of that time in the First Fleet were practicing, was pretty much herbal medicine combined with bloodletting, scarification, and the use of some toxic chemical drugs, like you've learned about, calomel or mercury, opium, etc., as a painkiller. So that's what they were pretty much what they were using. It still had a fairly large botanical medicine, herbal medicine base to it. They also then learnt what some of the local Aboriginal tribes were using in terms of native plants and incorporated that into their materia medica. So that was really what was happening there. With more waves of settlers, pioneers, you started to get doctors, physicians, regular physicians who were trained in London and parts of the UK, coming out here and practicing that style of medicine. So very similar to what you had in North America, what you learned about in your lesson there. So what you had was doctors coming over, and then people coming over practicing irregular medicine, hydropathy or hydrotherapy, mesmerism, some massage type therapy. You started to get osteopaths and chiropractors coming over in the late 1800s. So all that was going on. There was no regulation of medicine at that time. It was basically open and unrestricted, so anyone could hang up a shingle and practice what they like, although the conventional or the regular doctors pretty much felt they were it, that they were the top of the tree, and that the others were irregular and quacks and so forth. So that was the setting in the early 1800s through to the mid 1800s. And then the government, under pressure from the regular doctors, felt that they had to bring in some legislation to protect those practitioners, those doctors that were trained in the universities in London and the UK. So legislation came in, and they had the publication of approved doctor lists, doctors that were okay to go and see, and the others that were doing the hydropathy and the herbal medicine and everything else were pretty much seen as quacks. That meant that the regular doctors felt that they could put their prices up, and they were charging quite exorbitant fees. And the result of that was that basically you had a proliferation of irregular doctors practicing all sorts of things. And don't forget that you also had the migration of Chinese people from China and different parts of Asia who brought Chinese herbal medicine and acupuncture out to the colonies, and they were offering those services, although that was mainly to other Chinese miners and settlers and so forth. So all that was happening, and there was quite a bit of a fight, a Barney going on, as you saw what was happening in North America around this time. So that was really the setting from which naturopathy and Chinese medicine, massage, that's where it all came out of. Where do we go from here? Okay, so I suppose it's fair to say that training of natural medicine practitioners, naturopaths, late 1800s, early 1900s, even going through right up until the 1970s, was really a combination of self-learning, drawing from books, materia medicas and so forth that largely came from the UK and North America, as well as an apprenticeship style system. So a lot of the early naturopaths, early natural medicine practitioners, served apprenticeships with people who had done some training overseas, and they learnt their skills that way. As I said, that happened right through to about the 1970s, and then you started to get some informal courses starting to pop up in Chinese medicine, acupuncture, herbal medicine, naturopathy and so forth. And then it wasn't until really the early 1990s where you started to get government accreditation of courses. But that was in the vocational education sector, so diplomas and advanced diplomas, and then degree level training really didn't happen until the early 20th century, around 2000, 2001. So really we've come a long way very quickly, really from the 1970s to now, is where there was a formalisation of training of naturopaths in Australia.
Do you reckon the distance has a specific place to play there? Like when I think about because it's interesting, your first point is a really important one, and that is that we're all sort of talking about the development of American naturopathy. Now, when I think about that, one of my favourite shows ever is Deadwood. Have you ever seen it?
Never saw that program, no, unfortunately.
It's got filthy language in it, so I suppose, we need to put that disclaimer in it there. But it's set in basically the Wild West in about 1880. And one of the pivotal figures in it is the doctor, who's also the dentist, who's also the herbalist, learning all of this stuff from the local American Indian tribes as they existed at that time, and then with his half-year training in medicine from some dodgy university somewhere on the east coast of America. And because America's got more folks in it, I think communication and the movement of ideas happen quicker than in Australia, where obviously distance is just enormous. So does distance play a big deal in the history of the development of naturopathy here?
Yeah, good question. I think to some degree, I think it probably distance probably meant that practitioners who came out to Australia, whether they were practicing in hydropathy or, they were hygienists or even mesmerists or magnetic healers, what have you, there was probably less pressure from the medical profession and more liberty, more freedom to do their own thing. And I think that's pretty well illustrated by some of the really colourful characters that you had practicing in the mid-1800s, and again even through the 1970s, because when I did my training even into the 1980s, because when I did my training in naturopathy in 1980 in Brisbane, we had guest lectures from people, old-timers, who had been practicing naturopathy for, 50 years. Yeah. And they brought all these weird and wonderful contraptions like electrotherapy, these gadgets. They brought them into college and demonstrated them. And I mean, I don't know how many people were killed with some of these strange approaches, but they were really very, very colourful individuals who were very eclectic in their approach to medicine. Yeah. They used whatever they fancied, whatever they thought would make them a buck. I think it's fair to say, and has to be said, that really, from early settlement right through to even the current day, you've got a lot of practitioners out there, irregulars or complementary alternative therapists, whatever you want to call it, who are really just drawing from all different types of therapies and that they believe work. And so I think that distance factor really contributed to a sense of more liberty to do whatever you wanted to do. And that's probably less the case now as you have more government regulation, but that was part of it. Do you know that I think that a natural therapies product that a lot of people today grew up on, went through infanthood, relied upon, Lucas's pawpaw ointment. There's a fantastic story behind that. That's something that's sold in supermarkets and pharmacists and that today, and a lot of mums use it for nappy rash and for their own sort of skin conditions and so forth. Now, Thomas Lucas was a medical practitioner who moved out to Australia in, I think it was about 1875, and he started practicing, and what he would have studied would have been some herbal medicine, use of opium, use of mercury, use of some of those nasty chemical drugs that for purging and so forth, and bloodletting through leeches and slicing people and bleeding them with cups and so forth. That's what he would have practiced. And he came out, or what he would have learned when he did his training in England, he came out here, and like some of those various practitioners and pioneers in the different medical schools in 19th century North America, he became very dissatisfied with that approach. And poor old Thomas Lucas, he couldn't really make up his mind whether he wanted to be a preacher or a scientist. So what he did was he blended both together, and he practiced his own scientific approach to healing. He was very outspoken in Queensland, and I won't go into all of it and bore you to death, but it is quite colourful, and I think it's a good example of what was happening. But he bought a farm out in Beaudesert, quite near to where I used to live in Brisbane, and he started growing pawpaws. There was an earlier pioneer who set up the botanical gardens in Brisbane down by the river, and he had actually introduced pawpaws from, I think, Mexico. So Thomas Lucas bought a whole lot of seeds, planted them on his property, started growing pawpaws. Through his own scientific experimentation, saw that if he fermented them, it became a very powerful healing tool, and started to make and sell the stuff. He actually set up a pawpaw hospital, believe it or not, in New Farm, not too far away from where our Brisbane campus is, and used to treat people for all sorts of disorders using pawpaw ointment, but using an eclectic approach to healing that include herbs and all sorts of things. And he was a big writer. So I said earlier that we tended to draw upon books, materia medicas in herbal medicine and hydrotherapy and hygienist type therapies from North America and Europe, but there was quite a bit of writing that happened here in Australia as well. And Lucas was quite a prolific writer. He even wrote a book about Brisbane in the 20th century. This was in the 19th century that he wrote that. So, interesting character, and he upset a lot of people. He was a real stirrer. But he's a great example of the charismatic, colourful type person that contributed significantly to natural therapies and the development of naturopathy in Australia. More into the 1960s and 1970s, there was a guy who was still around when I did my training in Brisbane in 1980s, Cole Brandt, and he had studied naturopathy via apprenticeship largely, but he was a third generation nature cure practitioner. He came from Germany, was his family background, and he was very eclectic in his approach. He was a master of iridology, iris analysis, and I'll never forget it because when he actually taught me iris analysis, and in the first part of the semester, Cole would put some old Kodak slides of irises in a carousel, and he'd whip through them, and he'd look at an iris and he'd say, "Oh, that person had appendicitis, and they had their appendix removed when they were 35 years of age. And that woman's had 3 children. She would have had given birth to the first child when she was 23, the second child 25. And we couldn't believe this stuff, and sort of thought, that's a good yarn, but I don't know how much truth there is to it. In the second part of the year, he started to invite people to bring photographs of their own irises in. And he wouldn't identify who they belonged to, but he'd put them in the carousel, the projector, and he'd put them up and he'd say, now this person, when they were 17 years of age, they broke their right leg. This person, when they were 19, they had really bad asthma attacks and things like that. And people were falling over backwards because of the accuracy of what he was describing. So there was definitely something to it, and I really admired that guy. He set up the first, he became known as the flying naturopath because his son got his pilot's license, and Cole used to set up appointments in clinics throughout southeast Queensland, places like Warwick and Dalby and so forth. And he'd do a circuit, and his son would fly him around. He'd land in Warwick. He'd have appointments booked in for him. He'd go and he'd consult with about 50 patients in one day, move on to the next town, the next, treat another 50 to 100 people there over the next 2 days, and he'd do the circuit, and became very famous. He did his apprenticeship partly with Morris Blackmore, who was the founder of Blackmore's, the big health food company today. And Morris Blackmore was certainly one of our pioneers, another one of our colourful pioneers, who trained quite a lot of influential people who then went on to become educators in naturopathy right throughout Australia. And they were the early educators in the 70s and early 80s. So, you can really track our heritage back to about, probably half a dozen influential individuals in the 1970s who then passed on their knowledge, and that was the foundations of naturopathic education. Yeah,
it's incredible, isn't it? There's so many good stories in there because it's colourful kind of maverick characters. In my training, which was of course in the UK and in homeopathic medicine, we had druids and just weird folks coming in to teach homeopathy, but there was always flavoured with this sort of charismatic, almost spiritual, half science, pseudoscience angle to it. Hey, was Dorothy Hall a part of that in the 70s as well?
Yeah, interesting. Dorothy Hall was very much a part of it. She was one of the pioneers of naturopathy that we have to be grateful for. She published books on herbal medicine and iridology. She ran her own school in herbal medicine right through till I think about the late 1990s. The interesting thing about Dorothy, and she would have learned largely through apprenticeship and partly by self-education. She also took something of a spiritual approach, and Dorothy always had this approach that was the personalities. She was a little bit like homeopathy, I guess, Al, in that she looked at the personality of the individual and looked at addressing that personality. So rather than using homeopathic remedies, though, she largely used herbs. She believed that each herb had its own personality, and she would try to match that with the personality of the individual. And so she sort of developed a line of practice and education that was to some degree independent to a lot of the others in the Blackmore's school of therapy, I suppose you would say. But Dorothy was very important for establishing one of the early professional associations in naturopathy and natural medicine, the Australian Traditional Medicine Society. That was in the early 1980s, about 1983, I think. So we have to be grateful to her for organising the profession to some degree, because at that early time, she could foresee that there were going to be challenges and threats to our profession from the mainstream medical profession, and she became quite active in organising naturopaths and other natural medicine practitioners, herbalists and homeopaths and massage therapists and so forth, to give us some degree of organisation and standards of training in natural medicine education.
When I got to Australia, I was told that the ATMS was essentially begun by the college heads of the different colleges of, naturopathy, homeopathy, like Alan Jones, Peter Tamanillo. Those are the ones that I know of. Is that right, or is that a myth?
No, that's true. That's true. Firstly, Okay, if we talk a little bit about the organisation of the profession,
Yep.
I guess the National Herbalists Association of Australia was one of the first formal associations. I think that was established in about the 1920s. And then in the early 1980s, the Australian Natural Therapists Association was established.
Yep.
And then round about the same time, Dorothy Hall established the Australian Traditional Medicine Society. And as I said, that was really, same with ANTA, same with the National Herbalists, was about organisation, setting standards, an association that would be representative of practitioners. What Dorothy felt was that because there were quite a number of colleges that were being established in natural medicine around that time, that she felt that college owners or college representatives should really be involved in the direction of the professional association, so that standards of training could be established and maintained. She was very, very big on standards of education and training. So in the early days, probably with Australian Traditional Medicine Society, from 1983 through till about 2 or 3 years ago, largely the colleges were involved at the executive level. That's now changed, and so, you know, election of board members within ATMS is by election. But yeah, there's very much the representatives of colleges and institutions, universities were the reps.
And so, you know, it seems that a lot of the different associations and different professions in different countries, often an association pops up, sometimes with a personality clash or something like that. How have we got to the landscape that we do now? You've mentioned ANTA, ATMS, National Herbalist Association. How have we got there, and I suppose what's the consequence of that, and what's going on now with the issues, you know, regulatory issues that will affect us all?
Yeah, well, I think that in the early days, you had differences of thought, differences of opinion represented by those different associations. And one of the criticisms that's often levelled at our profession, naturopathy and natural medicine in general, is that there are so many different associations setting their own standards, doing their own thing. That's not truly representative of the profession. That's changed quite significantly. I think that today we've got a situation where, you know, the National Herbalist Association of Australia, the Australian Natural Therapists Association, the Australian Traditional Medicine Society, and the Australian Naturopathic Practitioners Association, in terms of standards of education, we all pretty much agree. So that I think that's where the profession has come a long way. The standards of education aren't too different from one association to the next. I think that's a good point to be at, but we've got to go one step further, and I think that's some representative body, whether it's a register, whether it's statutory legislation that leads to statutory registration of naturopathy. There are differences of opinion there, but certainly we need to all agree upon one standard of training, one standard of education, a register of practitioners, and that's very much where it's going. Now, I think a few things have contributed to that. One is that at the vocational education and training level, you had back in 2001, 2002, national training standards. And admittedly, this was at the vocational education level, but that's the majority of training courses around that time were still at the advanced diploma level, an advanced diploma of naturopathy.
Yep.
Since then, we've got more Bachelor of Health Science, Bachelor of Naturopathy, Bachelor of Complementary standards. And so that's pushing it up even higher, the standard up even higher again. Mm-hmm. So I think the profession's in a good position, but we've still got a way to go, if not statutory registration, which means an act of Parliament, which then says, like chiropractic, like Chinese medicine, like osteopathy and a lot of other allied health professions, you have government, largely government regulation of the profession. If not that, then at least co-regulation which is some level of government regulation combined with regulation from the profession in general. And I do believe that that's where we're headed. So not too much disagreement in standards of education, what a naturopath should be learning, should be studying, should be practicing even, because that's been quite eclectic in the past. Now I think that whether it's in vocational education or higher education, it's pretty much agreed upon that naturopathy includes the biosciences, the social sciences, nutritional medicine, herbal medicine, and then some elective studies, whether that be homeopathy or whether that be massage therapy or musculoskeletal therapy. So probably 90% of the professional associations, I think, are on the same page now, which is a pleasing place to be.
So that's kind of it's interesting, because that's where it's kind of a no-brainer, really, isn't it? And you're right, it just sort of feels like everyone's on the same page, really, with standards of education, standards of behaviour, ethics, all of those things. So, but it's not the same in every country, is it? So if we just sort of broaden the conversation and go back to the world, naturopathy in the USA, it's not like that, is it? It's naturopathy in the USA as a qualification, a postgraduate qualification on top of a science degree. So it's a postgraduate study. In the UK, there's hardly any naturopathy. Biggest college there, CNM, it's a diploma still, isn't it? At that particular college. So there is this diversity worldwide. Seems to me.
Yeah, that's right. And then you've got India, where naturopathy is a profession, and they have different standards again. And then right throughout Europe, you've got some countries in Europe where naturopathy or herbal medicine or nutritional medicine can largely only be practiced by medical doctors. So it's not an even playing field, and it's not the same globally. I tend to think that Australia's probably following the North American model, and it wouldn't surprise me that, in maybe 10 years' time, that naturopathy could become a postgraduate qualification where you have to gain your undergraduate qualification in sciences first, and then you enter into a postgraduate program, very similar to mainstream medicine in Australia today. And then once you enrol in your postgraduate qualification, your master's in naturopathy, that the focus is more on problem-based learning. And that's quite exciting. As I said, I think we've got a way to go there.
Cheers.
But it would raise the profession to another level again, I think. So it's certainly not the same in all countries. I do think that we're probably following the North American model, and I think that's pretty positive, really. One thing I would say there, though, because I think in North America there's been a perceived need to establish the profession almost as similar to an alternative doctor, an alternative general practitioner. And so there's been how can I put it? There's been a drive to practice only evidence-based medicine, and certainly we've experienced that here in Australia from about the mid-2000s, from about 2005, with Endeavour College and our degree courses. When our courses came up for reaccreditation, we were instructed, we were directed to incorporate much more research-based evidence into our curriculum, as has happened in North America. Now, I think that's been good. You absolutely need research-based evidence as part of your curriculum. But as a profession, we're not really there yet. There's a lot of research, but it's not necessarily great research. It's certainly not the standard of research that we need to see and that's acceptable to science and to allopathic medical practitioners and other agencies as well. So we need a lot more research in our profession, and until we get more research and a more appropriate research, I think we have to be very careful that we're not only practicing research-based medicine. And what I've seen, Al, is interesting. From about 2005, that pendulum I saw sort of swing right over to, we need to be only practicing research-based evidence. We only need to be teaching things that are research-based. And I kind of think that's come, like when I did my training in the 1980s, the pendulum was right over the other side, where it was largely empirical. We were learning stuff that was, to a large extent, folkloric,
Yep.
Empirical based. We were learning, as I said earlier, from pioneers of naturopathy in Australia who'd learnt their stuff from pioneers from North America and Europe. So the pendulum's come from very much an empirical approach to a research-based approach. And what I'd like to see now, that it comes back to the middle and we get a good balance of tradition empirical knowledge as well as research-based evidence at the point in time where we're still needing a lot of research-based evidence to inform our practice. So we need to be careful, because I think that's probably to some extent an error that's been made in North America, where you've got alternative doctors practicing, and a lot of the really good, really cool, really effective traditional therapies or traditional aspects of therapies, folkloric medicine, have been thrown out the window at some expense. And if we're left with only research-based evidence at this time, then we have got a lot to work with. So I think balance is important. We talk about balance in naturopathy and balance in natural medicine. Balance in training and balance in practice is an important thing to consider as well.
It's so interesting. I'm not really across the breadth of naturopathic research, but say in homeopathic medicine, we have 9 conditions that we know unequivocally we can say there is evidence for. There's only 9 things we could treat from that perspective, which we don't want to get into that situation. I think you're totally right. That
no,
we've got to honour the traditions and see that and the legitimacy of that, 100 years or 200 years or 1,000 years of traditional evidence. So.
There's also the philosophy behind it as well, which has evolved, from tradition. The principles of homeopathy and the philosophy and the principles of naturopathy, they're the framework. So they're the most important thing. We must not lose those at the expense of the profession to just and only research-based evidence, so that we're treating green allopathically. Green allopathy, that concept of using natural medicines as alternative drugs. We've got to be very careful we don't fall into that trap.
Well, that's a nice segue. That's a nice way to end it, actually, because one of the first lectures in this course that participants will be watching now is really just what I would describe as greenwashing of medicine as a branding exercise, cynical branding exercise to a large degree, and at the heart of it is philosophy. So thanks for that. Nice to chat. We could go on, couldn't we?
Oh, look, it's, history and the relevance to today's practice of medicine is fascinating, and it can be boring to our offsiders. But when you get into it, and I'd encourage students to have a look at some of the books, the early books around. There's a lot of it available. Go to our LibGuides on our website and look at some of the resources, some of the old texts and so forth that are on there. I was put in contact with a materia medica from, I think it was the 1870s, and just some of the herbal formulas that were in there. And I think we could learn a lot from some of those. So let's not throw the historical documents out or traditions out. Let's look at them and let's critically evaluate them against what research does exist, and look at the relevance of them, and I think that it can only enrich our practice. So I think that's the way to go, definitely.
Cool. Love it. Thanks for your time, mate.
Pleasure. Thanks, Al.
Take care. See you. Bye.
Yeah, see ya.